Our next speaker is Saskia Sassen. When we had all our speakers confirmed, we were all excited with all of them, and we were very excited about the whole day. But I have to say, personally, I was particularly excited to have Saskia Sassen come to speak today. It was over a quarter of a century ago that I picked up a copy of Global Cities off the ICA bookshop. And ever since then, she has transformed my understanding of how cities work. She is a rare thing, I would say. She treats economics as if people matter, and she treats people as if the economic circumstances in which they live also matters. Few people are as adept as Saskia at exploring the linkages between these two worlds of people and capital. Cities, of course, represent the apotheosis of this junction. They have been the site of agglomeration of both populations and economic activity for millennia. And while Saskia would not wish to be limited to the description of being an urbanist, I have a feeling a few of people, including her, will demolish that separation between the urban and the non-urban today. Her observations about what makes the cities and breaks cities, what builds cities and destroys urbanity, are particularly valuable in today's context. I would call her a detective. Cities have a visible and an invisible side. The visible side could mean, is a neighborhood well maintained or run down? Does its transport system work? Does it not work? Some of these things are quite easy to observe and to calculate. The invisible side might be a bit harder to understand, not so easy to observe and interpret. Who owns this house? What does it mean to own a house? What laws are supported or undermined by the patterns of ownership? These are the kind of invisible qualities which some of us don't really quite comprehend and which people like Saskia reveal to us. Much of what is important about cities is not in fact evident to the naked eye. They are buried in the financial transactions, regulations, politics, and economics. We need detectives like Saskia to reveal forensically, you might say, to borrow I.L. Weisman's terminology, the source of power and influence that ultimately determines so much of how our cities function. For over 3 decades, her prodigious publication output has consistently countered the assumed narratives of globalization. More recently, her writing has challenged the idea of globalization as a placeless or monolithic phenomena in order to explore its specific on-ground and territorial effects. And so, as our third speaker for today, please make her very welcome to the stage.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm very impressed with the whole project that I saw develop. I also want to thank Naomi Milgram, I don't know, there, and I brought you a copy of my latest book. It's really boring, but it's what I have. So I want to thank you for that great introduction. Where are you? Usually I don't get such a, introduction that actually gets at the heart of the matter a bit of what I do. That's very good. Thank you. So the one way of framing what I want to talk about is to ask the question, who owns the city? Now, there are many different regimes. I use this notion as a provocation and as an invitation to think. Who owns the city? There is a lot to be said about that. I'm going to confine myself to a particular set of issues. And I want to start, the academic in me can't resist, with a few items that have to do with how we study cities. I have always been very engaged by the question of, if I want to understand the X, how do I do that? In the academy, we have produced extraordinary amounts of knowledge, but there are no silos. They're partial. And the higher up we are, the thinner the little thingy, etc. So I find myself, to give it all a nice, elegant name, we academics, we have to do something about it. I call it the zone before method. Now, probably some of you know that there are 2 or 3 books, great books, that are called after method. They're pretty famous books. I want to I expose, I've understood that I do this before method. Once you enter method, you are a bit, you are under control of a set of rules. And so one way of thinking about that place before method is to think of it as the fuzzy edges of the paradigm. The paradigm at the center is strong, but at the edges, it's messy, it gets diluted. So that is what I like. I like that zone. Analytic tactics, or a tactical analytics, again, it's something that you move around, you position yourself differently, depending on what you want to discover. And again, discovery is a bit my mode. Now, here are just some of these, just very quickly, and I am engaged also in an academic project that is asking for a destabilizing of a lot of these sort of fixed knowledges that we have. That is, I must say, why I enjoyed this morning so much the preceding talks, because there is a fluidity, there is an experimental mode, et cetera, in the academy that is not always so easy. So one element here is to actively destabilize stable meanings. Today, the economy. What is that? It's not the same as it was 50 years ago. You have a whole set of these types of interrogations that you can do. Powerful explanations, we need them, but they're dangerous. If you're following a powerful explanation, there's all kinds of stuff that you do not see. And so in that sense, in the shadow of powerful explanations, again, what do I see? The territorial. For me, the territorial has been an extraordinarily important concept. And I think that certain segments of cities today are constituting a territoriality that is very partial, very concentrated. Think of the financial centers, for instance, but that connects with all kinds of other places in the world, but it's very partial. I like to make this juxtaposition. Finance, if a foreign firm wants to enter Manhattan, London, whatever, the big financial centers, Melbourne, you have a financial center, Melbourne? Yes. They get a permit, and the permit allows them to move throughout the whole country, but they are not interested in the country. They're interested in a very specific set of issues. That, so when I work on high finance, I'm interested in capturing that, rather than the generics. At the other end, human rights activists who want to go to a particular site in a national sovereign territory where they suspect there are bodies buried that were tortured. They get a permit to access the country, but they just want to go to that very specific site. That is what they want. I mentioned the bad and the good, so to speak, here, right? There are all kinds of intermediate conditions as well. So these are ways of both disassembling and reassembling a whole variety, of conditions that we usually relate to a bit as a generic. Expulsions. I think that today we're living in our modernity, in our sort of whole bunch of Western-style countries is one way of putting it. China, I would say, is a bit different. We're living in a period when one way of framing it, and this is going to organize the way I discuss cities, is that the material tells us less today than it used to. And I'm going to deal with housing questions, etc., also through that. But right now, what I want to get at is that there are sort of invisible, not easily captured walls. And when you cross them, you become invisible. You may still have your body. You are visible. But given the logics that we use, you become invisible. Very simple example, long-term unemployed people. After a certain while, they are no longer counted. They are not visible, in the charts that describe those without employment or whatever. Their bodies are there, but they're not visible. And I want to show you some of the issues that are happening with buildings. The building is a building is a building. No, not today when it comes to a whole bunch of great buildings. I would think this is a building, okay? But what is happening is the financializing of buildings, algorithmic mathematics, nothing to do with economics. Empty buildings in Manhattan, luxury buildings, empty. People think, oh, poor owners. Nobody's renting it or buying the flats or whatever. No. That building is producing more profit than if it were occupied. Why? Because through algorithmic mathematics, it is no longer a building. 16 complex steps. I have a buddy in Goldman Sachs who has shown me all of this. 16 complex steps, and you have a building is a source of assets. It's asset. The high investment circuit, they don't want derivatives anymore. Derivatives is what they sell to our pension funds. The high investment circuit, they know what they're doing, and they know what they want. They want asset-backed securities. And in the case of the United States, we have two very, very strong cases which represent a first experiment that involved 14.5 million households. They dressed it in the clothing of a subprime mortgage. It had nothing to do with mortgage. It was something else. And a lot in the 7 or 10 years that functioned, a lot of wealth was accumulated. All we hear about, mortgage, it failed, we had a crisis. Hidden is a whole set of actors who made a lot of money because it was not about 14.5 million houses. The image is a huge field where you're throwing in materialities. You could be dealing with a toilet, a wall, etc. So it was not a mortgage. And this is what algorithmic mathematics, and by the way, I don't have anything against the physicists, it's brilliant stuff. But it is a dangerous tool. So these are some of the issues that I want to sort of touch on, because I think we need to understand that, especially this final thing that I said, that big buildings now are being financialized, and this is happening in London, it's happening in all kinds of major cities. I'll give you some data on that. Now, one way of framing the question is to ask, I apologize, I'm a bit ill, what is the steam engine of our epoch? So the steam engine didn't change everything, but it changed just enough to launch a whole new era, partial, but consequential. So that is this notion of the steam engine. For me, high finance is one key element in the steam engine, and I want to use this, it's just one little bit of high finance, and invite you to look at this curve from 919 billion, in other words, almost 1 trillion, to 64 or trillion in 7 years, 6 years. Think of anything that has that growth curve. I tried, couldn't come up with anything. You understand that that's a very sharp growth curve. This is an instrument that worked beautifully for those who were on the winning side of that instrument, but was not good for those who were not on that side. Now, that value of those 62 trillion at that point is, number one, more than the global GDP of all the countries in the world in that year. Number two, it is only 10% of the value of high finance in that period. So that tells you something, high finance. Oh, and the other measure that one could bring in is the global GDP of all the countries in the world. I already mentioned that, but also the currencies issued by all the central banks in the world is less, much less than that. So what is high finance? It is not money. It is not about money. We use the language of money, and I find that very problematic that we cannot move out of that language. But it is something else. So I want to, well, one final element before I go to the next step here is this language here, dark pools. That's not my language. I could have coined that, but it is not. That is a former head of the central bank in the United States, Bernanke. When he stepped down in 2014, he said, you know, we have all these good things, good, nice, blah, and then we have two problems, two intractables. And one of them was this. And he said, dark pools in finance. Can you imagine a central banker using that language, dark pools of finance? I mean, so, and he said, most of the trading that happens today does not happen in the stock market. The stock market is a public event. We all know about it. We can, you know, etc. We are not all participants, but we could be participants. He said, most financial trading is happening in dark pools. These dark pools are privately owned networks by big banks. They bring in other bankers, and there are long waiting lists of bankers who want to enter. This is an invisible story, process, what happens, etc., to the persons who are not part of these trading pools. I mention all of these elements just to give you a sense of, if you want, an operational space that is marked by extraordinary tools, algorithmic mathematics, that has some brilliant people in it, that is producing a lot of this extraordinary wealth that we are producing in the last decade or two. I mean, the wealth factor has gone up. And cities are a key actor in all of this for a whole variety of reasons. Let me just mention two. One of them is that the knowledge function is so sharp, the curve, more, you need to know more. That has meant that urban space, the city, is critical because you can have all these different people, all these different firms, all the ones that just came from there and from here and from there, some other parts of the world. So the city itself, urban space itself, acquires a value to these types of actors that it didn't have 30 years ago, because you can concentrate. And so one, for those who might be really interested, I think what we're dealing with here is an intermediate sector. It's a sector that never loses. They're an intermediate, and they can deal with everybody. 25 hours of Mongolian accounting, 15 hours of Argentinian preference for investment. No firm can do that in-house. They need that intermediate sector. The intermediate sector never loses. And in a city like New York, in a city like London, well, New York is a bit more extreme, let me give that example. 30 to 40% of workers in that sector are, well, it winds up producing, let me simplify this, 40% of a rather rich, these are not it's not super wealth, but it is a far richer class, a lot of young people also in there, very brilliant, etc., etc. So because it needs the city because it needs to combine all the networks of all these knowledges and the people who went all over. So urban space becomes extraordinarily valuable to them, not in terms of the space itself, but as a container where, you know, you can have these intersections with all kinds of people. Now, let me give you an illustration, a first experiment. I already alluded to it. dressed in the clothing of a mortgage. And one way of naming it in plain language is when modest neighborhoods, I'm talking really modest neighborhoods, become part of global finance. In the past, they would not be part of global finance. Here they become part of global finance because the buildings are not functioning as buildings. The buildings have been monetized, transformed into something else. 16 million of these mortgage contracts were signed. In other words, what it meant was battalions of people going, you can own a house. They were going to the poor people who didn't have a house, which in the United States, that number is growing, but still it is a limited number. Most people still own their house there, but that's changing. So they would say, sign, and you can have a little house. And they signed. And the notion was you had to get each of these people who was doing this 700 contracts a week. In a very short period of time, 16 million contracts were signed. Of those 16 million contracts, 14.5 went broke. But that took 7 to 10 years. And as I said, a lot of profit was made. And expose, when you see the second phase that I will also get to, you can see that was like a first, let's try it out. Footnote, I don't know if any of you heard about a few months ago, 14 municipal governments in Italy, and this is just one example of many, but this made the headlines. 14 municipal governments in Italy all went broke on a particular instrument that they had bought at the same time. This has happened in a whole bunch of places. What had happened? They thought they had made a loan. The municipal governments thought. It wasn't a loan. It was a derivative. The derivative failed, poof, they all went broke. And this has happened to a whole bunch of places, also in the United States. So I just want to set sort of, create a kind of a setting. Now back to these mortgages. Here are some of these numbers. Some of them repeat, etc. I want you to also think, what is 14.5 million households? Well, that could be 20 million, 30 million. I'm Dutch. My country has like 16 million people. It took 7 to 8 years. It's invisible. Those people were thrown out of their house. Not everybody, but most of them. What does it mean to throw out 20 million people and it's not visible? These are things that I am really obsessing about. What are we seeing when that, such a phenomenal event, because of course it's different times of the day, different month of the year, whatever it might be, but they disappeared in the woodwork. And again, when I think the Netherlands, a voice from above saying, all right, people of the Netherlands, out. Out. Where you go, I don't care, but out. We would notice that. But this distributed thing, the little house here, the little house there, that neighborhood, etc., we don't. Here, okay. This instrument has entered Europe, and I'm waiting for it to enter India. It's devastating. And here you just have some figures. I'm sorry, this should really go on to current year, but it's cut off. Now, one outcome of what I'm describing, back to the mortgages and all the people expelled, etc., is a kind of empty urban land. And I'm sort of watching in the United States saying, okay, what's next? What's going to happen with this empty urban land. I'm looking at my clock here. Now here is yet another mutation. This is more advanced. This is algorithmic math applied to asset-backed securities rather than to derivatives. As I mentioned, the high investment circuit is not interested in derivatives at this point. Asset-backed securities is what they want. And the asset entails some sort of materiality. Now, here I'm looking at the top 100 cities in the world. They are vastly concentrated in the West, as we say, the West, broadly understood, which are sort of the objects of desire of investors, of all kinds of buyers. The numbers that you see here, I just want to make sure that it's clear. If you look at the New York Metro in the United States, that figure, 55, is just 1 year and just buying, no building. The growth, 10.9%, is a growth compared to the prior year. So a city like New York and London, they already have undergone this quite a bit. I'm going to elaborate, but first I want to go. So this is when it's only foreigners who are buying. And there you see London is the queen of the domain. And so, a datum that some of you might be aware of. Just to give you an example, I sort of find it entertaining. The Qatari royals, Qatar, and I don't have anything against them, frankly, they now own more of central London than the Queen of England. I mean, in some ways, that's sort of, you know, how neat. Of course, there is a duke that has lived for 800 years in different personas, who is the main owner still. But, and then when you go down, etc., here I want to just make a couple of points. See, Amsterdam, that rate, that 248% is the growth rate compared to the prior year. Why is that so high and say New York and London less? Because in New York and London, they have already been buying for quite a few years. So Amsterdam is a more recent arrival. The same thing with some of the, like Shenzhen, is there 426? That is much higher than if you now take Beijing or Shanghai or even Nanjing. Why? Same phenomenon. They have been buying in China, in those major cities. And so now it's a turn for cities that are not as grand, let's say, as Beijing and Shanghai. Now, here are some figures. This is the case of Germany, except for Nanjing there at the bottom. But see, Berlin has this in 2015, 11, etc., and then a decline. The minus 6.2 is a decline compared with the prior year. It's not a fall in the value. So they have done Berlin, they've done Frankfurt, because there are only so many properties that they're going to buy. So they move on. Then München is done. Now Hamburg has a higher rate of growth compared to the prior year, because Hamburg is the latest arrival. And same thing with Nanjing. Nanjing has higher, not as high as Shenzhen, Nanjing is in China, but much higher than Shanghai or Berlin, or Beijing, because, you know, they have been working. It's a recent arrival to the club. Now, here I want to enter the question of the material. So I have given you some figures, some types of logics, very fancy logics, very interesting logics that are at work, reshaping, etc. And then this issue of the material and what the material today tells us. And I had to go. This is central London, and these are all sort of fancy buildings. Some of them are quite nice. This one, I think, is not so great. But anyhow, that's another question. I'm talking to some architects here, I guess, so I better shut up on that one. That's the Thames, as they say. We always say the Thames, the Thames. And so I had to walk there. I had written some articles. Somebody had done an interview, and they said, come, let's go walk where this place where you are, right? And that's always full of tourists, of course. So it turned out to be interesting. So I heard people say, look at all, and I was aware of these buildings, look at all these wonderful British buildings, all these tourists enamored with London. All of these buildings are owned by one Chinese company. We don't see that, And again, it's this notion of the material, that we think the material is a simple something. There it is. No, it doesn't tell us. You understand what I'm getting at here, right? Now, I also want to emphasize that China is the main investor in the world right now. You know that the World Bank that China set up is bigger than the World Bank, the Western World Bank. So that is why I wind up talking about China far more when I talk about these issues than other countries. China is really, and they are investing all over the world. I mean, they are just in a zone. Now, the top 100 cities that I'm looking at represent 10% of the world's population, 30% of the world's GDP, 76% of property investment. Now, property investment is the language used. It's not quite right, because that's a common term, so they say property. No, it's something else. It's a kind of a mode of acquiring that is involved here. So I just mentioned that as a footnote, that to me that is a problematic designation. According to Savills, if you want to know anything about housing and buying and all of that, they are leaders. They are everywhere. I was in Phnom Penh trying to figure out something, and they had the data. None of the experts, whatever, had the data. They did. According to them, the worldwide value of real estate assets is now 217 trillion. That is a lot. That is far more than global GDP of all the countries in the world. So I mention that comparison because that means that the valuation factor is very important. And coming back to what I said originally, this is not simply about selling houses. This is about using properties to generate asset-backed securities. So it's not that they're buying a building, they're probably buying a financial instrument. And again, that's invisible to the eyes of your average person looking at those buildings. So we are losing something. There is a way in which the material condition is not quite telling us, lacks the speech it once had. When you saw that materiality, you knew what you were looking at. Here not. Now, again, what I'm talking about concerns a minority of buildings. It's not a majority of buildings. Now, these are just little cases. This is 65,000 buildings in Greater London that are all owned by entities. They're entities that are outside the UK. Not a single one is a UK entity. We don't know the names. I mean, the Panama Papers have helped, etc., but it is a very arduous work. So, and their use, sometimes it's clear, sometimes it's not. I mean, that's a lot of buildings. In Manhattan, we have the clearest case. We also have that in London and in other cities, but here is one very clear example. Now this is different. These are newly built buildings, very fancy buildings. And so 122 of the 192 condos are owned by people who used shell companies that hid their identities. Now the classic, and here is another one like that, the classic understanding is that you cleanse your money by buying a building. And that is happening there. But again, there is something else that is also happening. And that is that these buildings that now, some of them are completely empty, that these buildings are producing more, plusvalia, sort of more earnings to owners if they are empty than if they are occupied. In other words, a renter or a buyer becomes a secondary choice. Why? Because and here I go back to algorithmic math, because a high investment group, they want asset-backed securities. We have sort of financialized a lot of stuff. Big buildings, till now, were about being occupied, having that kind of income, either by selling them or by renting them. But now it's the turn of these buildings. So the empty building is producing more profits for the owners than if it were occupied. I said that at the beginning, and I'm beginning to end with that. And there are a couple of things here. One is the question of algorithmic mathematics. So if you take Goldman Sachs, right? The back room, if you enter their offices, the back room is a space where the secretaries used to sit. And as I said, now it's 100 physicists. The physicists are brilliant. I love them. I love the way they think. I love those intelligences. For them, it's an experiment. It's a challenge. And as I mentioned, this buddy showed me, it's many steps. The thing that we need to understand, and it's not easy to understand, is that from the perspective of that financial firm and all the others that are doing this, it's not the building that is in play. It's an instrument that you can buy, sell in a day or whatever. So the transformation that algorithmic mathematics can do is quite extraordinary. That there is the building. The building is just one element that is fed into this very complex instrument. Now, I've been giving this talk, and I've been writing about it, etc. So now I get all kinds of mail from people who are asking me if the empty building in Milano that they see every day is. You can imagine, right? And in fact, it turns out that there are more empty buildings in some of the sort of, fairly fancy cities that are delivering, a kind of profit. I mean, it's a very problematic, I would say, element in the story of these types of cities. This is not happening in small towns, etc., but it's happening in more and more cities. I just found out, and I can't mention the countries, that in 2 African countries, this is also taking off. You understand the concept. The concept is actually, it is an amazing source of profit. Given that transformation, it's incredible, the profit that can be made. Because also this notion of buying, selling, buying, selling, buying, selling. Now, I want to come back to one element. I just want to make sure that it is clear that the high investment circuit, they are the ones who, in a way, pushed this. They didn't know what they were pushing when they started, probably. But this notion that you can transform something into an asset-backed security. That is the issue. Some materiality. So you can imagine a city is full of materialities. I'm watching what's next. What are they going to financialize next? Because now the instrument has been developed. I mean, it varies, different banks do different things. So that is sort of a disturbing element here. I just want to move. So let me just jump now to a whole other condition, urban condition, sort of ask that with that question. What are the urban formats of the future? And now I want to withdraw a bit from this whole algorithmic mathematics and all of that, and just look at cities. And I have some images here. Some of you are probably familiar. The growth of the periferia, as they say in Latin America, is expanding. And here you can see how it expands, and it's cheek to cheek. These are familiar images, I'm sure, to some of you, with the upper middle classes or something like that. This is an image that, by the way, I say it because I'm always asked if I don't mention it, there is no place in the world where you can stand and see this. Both are real, but a photographer juxtaposed them. In other words, the periferia, modest, some of it works very well, some of it does not. And then up there, the high-rise buildings. In many parts of the world, Europe is different, and I have the deep impression that your country is more like Europe. But in many parts of the world, this is happening. And here, if you want a third element in this story that I'm telling you here, there is not much land left that is not owned by major firms, etc., etc. The land grabs, the water grabs, the mining. More and more people who are rural are leaving those rural areas. The only place they can go to, where they can put their body down somewhere or even build a little house, are urban areas. There was a time when we had a lot of land that was sort of underused. That has changed. So now we have a period where the non-urban becomes a key vector to understand certain urbans, not all urbans, but certain urban situations. Between the, as I said, the water grabbers, the Coca-Colas and the Nestles, etc., 35 countries, governments, and 150 plus corporations through a whole set of different economic modes are buying, grabbing, etc., expelling people. So I find myself, I who have long worked on cities, I've also worked on other subjects, I find myself that today, if I want to really have a global perspective on the urban condition, and that doesn't mean all countries in the world, but it means quite a few, a growing number. One issue, one point, one fact is that there is no more land. Most land is now owned. And by the way, that to me then has engendered also a third type of migrant subject. We have the refugee and we have the regular immigrant. Those are familiar subjects. Now we have a third migrant subject. And when she appears at our borders, she's coming from a country where the GDP per capita is growing. But why is it growing? Because so many people have been expelled. The estimate, these are very vague estimates, is 1 million every year of rural people, smallholders, are getting displaced. So we now have a situation where in many parts of the world, the only place where you can put your body down if you're poor is a city. And I think you begin to see that in the global south, you begin to see that. So the smallholders which have been able to keep the land alive, for centuries, they are now being expelled. And what do we have? We have all kinds of very modern modes of producing that are killing the land. So it's a very weird, it's not just the whole question of change, climate change, etc. That is in there too. That also adds, that also reduces the working land that we might have. It's just a whole mix of conditions. And when you begin to look at the world that way, there is something that is truly problematic. And when there is no land, the shanties are being built on water. This is also, we have millions of people who are living like that. Now, concluding, why does all of this matter? And it seems to me that the city, a working city, is one of the few spaces where those without power have historically gotten to make, a history, a local economy, etc., etc., a culture. There are moments, second point, in the routines of a city when we're all urban subjects. Most of the time we're not. But say, rush hour traffic, the subway and all of that, we all become urban subjects. The cleaner next to the whatever, fancy, whatever. And when the city, in a way, urban space, livable urban space, has the power to hack all the other, more specific subjects we also are. And it makes us into urban subjects. So these are, for me, some of the elements that, I'll just leave that slide on, some of the elements that make me say that what is happening, these modes of using the urban condition are truly problematic. There is something very special about the city. In the latest project that I'm working on, I call ethics in the city. Most of the treatises that we have on ethics are all beautiful, etc. They sort of hover above urban space. Urban space inevitably will have inequalities. Inevitable. So the theoreticians of ethics, they stay away from that. And so I'm doing this project in several cities around the world. What do the poor, the disadvantaged, what is it that they really object to? And we don't really know. We, the middle classes, we think, we know. We don't. We don't what is really offensive and what they say, okay, yes, I'm poor, that's okay, but, etc. And so I grew up in Latin America. This is the last image that I'm giving you. And the poor, they were quite mobilized in Latin America, I must say, in Buenos Aires. And they would stand and say, one way of putting it is to say, power, whatever government, the rich, power. Power, we're just letting you know that this is also our city. And that kind of standing, I think, is great. Thank you very much.